have the pleasure to introduce this international conference on Europe, Which Growth Wanted, which is organized in cooperation with Bocconi University and CEPS. And I have the greater pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon in ISPI. On a topic very much related to the one of the conference, we are issuing today a policy paper by Carlo Altomonte and Antonio Villafranca titled EU Economy Fit for the Future, with contributions from several friends of ISPI, including Daniel Gros, Alicia Garcia Herrero, Antonio Misiroli, and Georg Zachmann. Antonio will then moderate the first session on a world of instability, the EU quest for sustainable growth. Carlo will then moderate the second session, which we have titled Engines for Growth, Energy, Trade, and Investments. These days seem to be the right ones to nourish reflections on the growth model of Europe. It is crucial to understand the way the Union's economy has been working during the last couple of decades and how it has reacted to the impressive series of shocks and crises that we had to confront. The last ones, in particular, the pandemic and the war, can tell us a lot on the strengths and weaknesses of Europe as well as on its potential that we have to exploit. The famous sentence by Jean Monnet that l'Europe se fera dans les crises et sera la somme des solutions apportées à ces crises has never been true and important as it is now. Most frequently, Monnet is interpreted in an optimistic way, in the sense that the reaction of crisis of Europe's economy, of the Union's institutions, the EU's citizens and member states tends to be constructive in a creative manner. A shock comes, Europe reacts and finds itself more integrated and ready to confront the next difficulty. However, pessimism is also allowed, and Monnet, in spite of its intention, could be interpreted the other way around, that when a shock comes, it weakens Europe and makes it less ready to confront the next problem. Personally, I'm optimistic. Once we have a good critical understanding of the behavior of the European economy up to now, we can try to be normative and suggest future strategies. I'm sure that today's conference will give us a lot of ideas for our research and will suggest relevant strategies for Europe's economic policies. And let me conclude by thanking everybody for being with us in this occasion. And I'm also honored to thank Valentino Valentini, the Italian Deputy Minister of Enterprises and Made in Italy, for being with us and giving the floor for his welcome remarks. And the floor is with you, Minister Valentini. Do we have him? Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Your invitation. It is for me an honor and a pleasure to be able to take the floor at the beginning of your conference. I've always been close to ISPI, and I must admit here openly that I read the very, how should I put it, very ample production of ISPI, which I consider to be of highest quality. So I'm sure that also out of your today's proceedings, many ideas will come forth that will then be taken up by the various publications. To come directly to the question at hand, the title, and I would like to take inspiration from the words of the previous speaker. I am also an optimist, and I also agree with Jean Monnet that Europe is just has gone from crisis to crisis. If you think about it, the European Union itself came out of one of the largest crises we've known so far, which was that of the Second World War, and the European Union was always able to find its best when put in a corner. To cut a long story short, let's come to the current situation. The pandemic seemed to be able to destroy Europe at the seams. At the first, the European countries were trying to go each their own way, try to cope with this crisis on their own, until they found out they couldn't succeed, and they were much better out trying to act unified. And out of the crisis, which would have destroyed the European Union, we had two outcomes. Well, first of all, we were able to pool our resources, but secondly, we were able to enlarge for the first time the perimeter of a federal budget. So a federal, again, Europe able to make common debt in order to solve a common crisis. Of course, we don't have to think only of the pandemic and the solution we found to the pandemic, because the pandemic also was followed by a second shock, that of the war in Ukraine, that compounded a crisis that had started already during the pandemic. How should I put it? The crisis I'm talking about, if the pandemic started a monetary crisis, because we used the monetary level in order to cope with the economic consequences of the pandemic, we found ourselves in an energy crisis in part that had already started, because everybody thought that the transition justified basically the fact that we stopped investing in fossil fuels. And at the time, if you remember, during the pandemic, Exxon was worth less than Exxon as a company was worth less than Netflix as a company, just to give you an idea. And so being the energy sector a cyclical sector, we compounded a crisis, because as the pandemic come to an end and the economic started again, we decided, or we found ourselves in a crisis given to a series of shortcomings of we saw the logistic crisis, the lack of transportation, and also a fourth crisis was the fact that we had decided that our transition, at least on this part of the world, in Europe, we decided that our transition had to be based on natural gas, which with the same production of energy has half the production of CO2 than many other fossil fuels, and gas was at the center of the crisis of the war in Ukraine. So we find ourselves in the squeezed between two crises, let's say the consequences, the economic and social consequences of the pandemic that continue to unfold, and the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine that we don't know how much they will continue, but certainly there'll be tension on energy prices that will continue for the forthcoming years, because as China, for example, comes back to the market, I expect to have tension on the cost, on price of materials and on the price of oil. And in this situation, we also are in the middle of a transition, which is not just a green transition or a digital transition. It is not just a question of going to a reduction of CO2, but we are going through a transition that implies the revision of the way we manufacture and implies a profound revision of all our structures. So we found ourselves probably in one of the most difficult periods, at least in terms of outcomes, because we have a crisis of institution, an economic crisis, and all of those crises are global. So, and Europe has to, in the middle of all this, find its own way. And after this large and big picture, I'd like to come to the what we are discussing now, for example, as member states. You know, there's going to be a special European Council in which one of the major issues will be how to respond to the way one of our major allies / partners have responded to these global problems that I talked to you about. That is to say, the IRA and all the other measures that were put into place by the United States in order to cope with the problems I dealt with. And Europe now finds itself again faced with a decision that can burst Europe at the seams or can compound Europe again. That is to say, do we respond to the fiscal stimulus of the United States individually as single countries, or are we able to find the strength and the ways to respond as a European Union? If we go, and I will come to an end because I cannot take up all the time that was given to me. I will give you my view. My view is the following. I think that we should improve upon our partners, especially the large countries that think to be able, because of their fiscal margins, to be able to go on their own. That is a self-defeating strategy. You might be able as France or Germany, as big countries, to be able to go a step further, probably for the next couple of years, but you can't think of being competing with the United States and with the other large trading areas in the world if you compete as a single country. No single country in Europe will be able to compete and to have a sustainable growth if not in a big and wider market, because we can compete as Europe, but we cannot compete as Italy, as France, and Germany. And that goes over and above all of the discussion that are frugal, not frugal. I will not get into the other details that compound the issue that I've discussed. But my point of argument is, how can we, as pro-Europeans, or how can Europe finally realize that, and again, we are faced with an existential crisis, and we can emerge out of this crisis stronger only if we're able to find solidarity, common cause, maintain the single common market is probably our greatest advantage in a global competition, because we will see not a flat globalization, but this new globalization has hills and valleys, and we'll be competing as areas. If we manage to preserve and enlarge what has been our single market, which is not a market just in terms of goods, but also has to be a single market in terms of values and rule-based economy, only in that way we'll be able to compete together. And we have to find again a way to be able to do it again one more time. It's another crisis. We're faced it. Is it the same crisis? It is another crisis. I don't know. But certainly this is one of the issues we'll be discussing from here until probably the next year or two.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Antonio, I guess the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. So let's start with the first session, a world in instability, the EU quest for sustainable growth. Is everything already in the title? So basically, in a world of growing rivalries, divisions, and war, unfortunately, in a world also of trade measures, countermeasures, we are basically questioning the very EU growth model, which is an export-led model, so with globalization and free trade at its core. It is just a very brief introduction because we have a panel of top-notch experts and personalities, so I don't want to steal time to the discussion. So let me just briefly introduce our guest. Marco Buti is Head of Cabinet of European Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni. Thank you, Marco. Maria Demertzis, Senior Fellow at Bruegel and part-time Professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Sylvie Goulard, on my left, President of DFI, the German-French Institute, and since a couple of months, I think, she got back to the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. And last but not least, Daniel Gros, Distinguished Fellow at CEPS. We organize this event, as Franco mentioned, with Bocconi University and CEPS. So thank you, Daniel. So, Marco, let me start from you. First thing first. Next Generation EU, we are in Italy, so of course it is an unprecedented key decision of the European Union which was taken after COVID-19. Now, the second black swan in a row, the Ukraine war. So my question is, if and to what extent the Next Generation EU is still fit for purpose, if we have to reconsider, if we can relaunch on the usual suspect in Italy. I mean, if we need more than that. Please, Marco.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, ISPI, for the invitation. Okay, before I come to your question, I would like to address one point that Franco made before. You mentioned Jean Monnet. Everybody knows the famous quote. But I think there is not a question of being optimistic or pessimistic about that. I think basically the responses to the crisis, to the various crises, will have to pass or not what I have called in some papers in the past couple of years the Jean Monnet compatibility test. And the Jean Monnet compatibility test, you judge the responses in terms of economic coherence. So are they adequate for purpose? So the economic policy are up to responding to the magnitude of the nature of the crisis? Are they institutionally coherent, responding to the respecting, dynamic subsidiarity, they call it upwards and downwards? And finally, the third dimension is political coherence. So whether, we can keep member states, but in particular, we can enjoy the support of the population. My judgment is that the response to the financial crisis did not pass the Monnet compatibility test, at least not fully. I think we have a chance, jury's still out, that next generation EU will, both along the three dimensions that I mentioned. Now, the question, your question, Antonio, so it's next generation EU fit for purpose after Russia's war of aggression. So my answer is, in general, yes. I think in particularly, broadly, yes. Now, on in general, I think we have had, maybe nobody talks about that very much, but I think it's an important element. In the huge misfortune of the COVID crisis, with all the dramatic human cost that we incurred in that, we had two elements of luck. One is that we were in a quite extraordinary period of electoral peace. So that allowed member states, when coming to the negotiations, actually not to be under the immediate pressure of the next national or even regional elections. So this is one element. The second element is that the crisis hit us in March, so spring 2020, and the new commission was just been installed in November, beginning of the year, and it had conceived the green transition, the double transition, as the leitmotif for their term in office, so the strategic goal. So in a sense, we had already made the strategic agenda there for that one could, so we didn't have to invent things, all of a sudden, as we have done in other cases. The agenda was there to be implemented, not only, but with the foresight of actually leaders coming and putting the resources, we could actually put the money where our mouth was at the time. Now, if you jump from then to today, if anything, the approaches that we pursued at the time, that we put in place, so the double, sometimes one can even talk about the triple transition with the social element. If anything, have to be accelerated now. So if you think about it, the energy crisis, so the green agenda, but also here it refers to the IRA, the response to the US move, also the digital agenda is really very relevant for that. So I would say, yes, in general, if we didn't have a next generation EU ready, one would have to invent it somehow. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I think the part that is that was initially proposed by the Commission, which was the non-allocated part of the envelope, going for what one could call European public goods, was actually squashed, a bit reduced during the negotiations. But by and large, I would say this was... now, in particular, I think I would say broadly, yes. The shock of the war, the break in the value chains, the inflation had clearly an impact on the implementation of the programs. The Commission came forward with guidance on the implementation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which I recall is the 90% of next Generation EU last week, actually, together with the communication on competitiveness, and open to a certain revision of.
There's the point, if I may ask, because this was a hot topic during the Italian electoral campaign.
Eccomi, sono Valentini, è un brutto momento?
I don't know what happened. I mean, one hot topic was what is the room for a sort of renegotiation of the recovery fund because of inflation.
Yeah. Okay. Now the answer is retail yes, wholesale no. So if we go project by project, and I think we were very clear in the guidance that the Commission published last week, project by project, where you can actually justify that certain, especially infrastructure projects, are not, you cannot pursue them anymore because of then you can revise that, we can reallocate some funds. I think that is possible. Wholesale, thinking about visiting globally, as was a bit the tone during the electoral campaign in Italy as well as in other countries. For the reasons I mentioned before, I would say no, definitely not, and not the case. One element to conclude, in the RRPs, so the national plans, there are investments and there are reforms. One can consider, under certain circumstances, duly justified targeted changes for the investment part. The war has not affected the reforms part. So on that, I think there is no question that will have to be delivered in full.
That's why it is called a facility, not a fund. It doesn't only give money.
Exactly.
It's give money, but there is a constraint for giving money, which are reforms. So since we've already mentioned inflation, now we have an economist here, Maria Demertzis, so it's the inevitable question to you. High prices, skyrocketing, not really skyrocketing, I mean, interest rates on the rise. How to strike a deal or find a compromise you prefer between, taming inflation on the one hand, without, on the other hand, decreasing the economic potential, even because, the last forecasts say that there will be a zero growth, maybe a little more than zero. Very recently, I mean, the potential, the economic growth has been upgraded, so to say, in Europe very recently over the last 1 month or so. So how to find a compromise between the two things?
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's Antonio, and also thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a delight to be here in such a prestigious company. The inflation question, right? And I'm actually delighted to hear the Commission has come up with. The Commission originally was very strong on sort of non-negotiating, but I think the issue of inflation for some countries can be really quite prohibitive. And when you talk about inflation in Europe, although we have one institution that is responsible for inflation, the inflation in Europe go from 5% in some countries all the way to in excess of 20 in others. Can you imagine 20% inflation in, say, some countries? Effectively, your salary is being eroded sort of, by the amount of 1/5 every year, which is remarkable. And particularly since also we have forgotten about inflation in the euro area for a very long time, and all of a sudden we are having to sort of double down on this. Now there is some good news, and that if you look at the inflation numbers in Europe, they have peaked, and they've actually coming down a little bit, and that is entirely due to the fact that energy prices are coming down. If you look at the components of inflation, it is really energy that is coming down, is not food. Food is still sort of is adding on to inflation rather than subtracting from inflation. Now, however, I think what drives and I don't have an inside knowledge of what the ECB is doing, others might have better actually insight there, but my guess in terms of what the numbers are telling us and the methodology that is being communicated, the rationale is the following, that what we call now the second run effect, so the inflation that is now entrenched into the economy is simply because there is increases in order to meet up for the high inflation demand, they are now entrenched. And the ECB is quite clear that as soon as there's things that it can do about inflation on the entrenched part, it will do. And the question is, where are we on this? Do we still see the components of inflation that the ECB can act upon? Are they still there, or are they coming down? And the answer is no. If you look at the part of inflation which is called core inflation, is the one that is, you take away volatile parts, namely energy and food, and you end up with core inflation, which is really what the ECB is looking at. And then within that, it looks at what is the bit that I can affect, namely the demand components of the economy that I can do something about. And if you look at that component, it's still going up. And that is why...
A little more, less than before. I mean,
well, it's an estimated part, so it's not a measured part. They estimate that with, and actually, if you look at the estimated, I don't have that in real time, but the last time the estimate was made, it still is increasing. We are talking now about 2 to 3 percentage points of the 9 percentage points that is the level of inflation in Europe right now, in the euro area. That explains, I think, the decision. We've seen a 50 basis points, half of a percentage point increase. The ECB has been very clear that there will be another 50 basis points and a 25 basis points after that. They're really running after that component until, in my view, they see that component also tipping off. We will not see, in my view, a change of policies. But let's just wait and see a little bit where we are right now in terms of interest rates, which I think is your question. I mean, how do you balance the growth while interest rates are going up? So right now, interest rates on the deposit rate is 2.5%. We are expecting it will go up to 3, maybe 3.5, thereabouts. Let's just, depending on which interest rate you look at, let's just take 4% point. Before the financial crisis, all the assumptions in the models that were running the future, as it were, so what is your view about the future? How do you see the economy evolving? Had an interest rate of 4%. All the simulations that we used to do in order to say, okay, what does the future look like? The assumption in all our exercises was that the interest rate was 4%. Now, there is a lot that has happened in the context of the secular stagnation or the transitions. So I'm not arguing that 4% is justified. What I'm arguing is that the levels of interest rates that we're seeing now, and we possibly see before they reverse, are not unknown to us. We have seen them before, and we know how to act with these levels of interest rates. So there's nothing to write home about. And to your question, it is absolutely essential that we allow for interest rates to go up, to remove this interest rate, to remove this inflation component. And I should remind you that inflation rates at 9% on average, where interest rates are 4%, you still have very negative real interest rate. It is the real interest rate that drives the economy, and we're still at negative territory. In negative territory in interest rates, we have to think about the price of something being negative. What does that mean? The price of something being negative is so you're still in that era where interest rate is not really a very good signal. I personally think increasing the interest rate allows for the signal component of interest rates to function again. When interest rates go up, it follows risk, and they go up, this is a risky thing, don't do it. I mean, it's a good signaling property that interest rates have, which I think we lost as a result of being on the zero lower bound, and therefore it's very distortioning for the way that your investment decisions will be made, and I think that's important. But there is one thing, and that is the financial stability thing, right? Which I think this is what you wanted to ask.
I didn't mention, but of course there is a problem of financial stability, not only inside the European Union, which our shoulders should be covered to some extent by the European Central Bank, but outside the European Union, especially when it comes to developing countries and poor countries, because with raising interest rates, we run the risk that some of them could be on the brink of default.
So if you allow me, I don't want to comment about the developing world because the stories there are very complicated, and if you want to add the green transition element there, then we get really talking about a very different set of medicines that we need to use. But in the European Union and in the Eurozone in particular, I think on the private side, the fact that we see an increase in interest rates, in my view, do not pose any risks on indebtedness, simply because the financial crisis allowed us to first robustify the system through the banks, but also run down on what we used to call the bad debts. Italy did a tremendous job back in the financial crisis. Other countries that had left behind are now doing tremendously in terms of bringing down the debts. On the private side, I don't think there is an issue there. It is the fiscal that we worry about. We have 3 crises later, the levels of fiscal debts are big. Are there a problem? Well, debts are huge. And we have to sort of reckon with the fact that we have huge fiscal debts. I don't think there is an imminent threat, but the debts are what they are. I am very happy that the European Central Bank created an instrument for potentially dealing with this. I hope that it never has to use it because it will not be an easy instrument to use. It would require an exercise that it would be politically driven. even though the ECB has been clear that it doesn't want to be political and it will make its own assessment, it enters territory that, in my view, requires democratic accountability. So I'm hoping that it will never have to use it, also because it means that there's no need for it. And that would be an important thing to address. But you have to remember, the EMU is a second best scenario because we are facing architectural issues. EMU will never be optimal because we have X number of sovereigns, hopefully more in the future, but one central bank, and that means that there will never be a perfect coordination in the way that there is between one sovereign and one central bank. So in the context of an imperfect architecture, I think that at least for the moment, the risk of financial stability are tamed.
This is good news that we want to share with everybody. In this moment, we really need it. So now I move to Daniel. Daniel, we learned that, okay, interest rates are going up. There is also the position of the European Central Bank. But lucky enough, I mean, growth is doing relatively well. It is above zero for the next months, especially because international trade is very resilient over the last years. We talk about now French shoring, friends in international trade, wherever they are. But some friends of us, the United States, I mean, they don't look so friendly recently with the Inflation Reduction Act. In your view, what is the best response of the European Union to this? Because we also run the risk of escalation on subsidies, which is not necessarily in our interest. What's your point of view?
I would say that we should just keep it cool. Don't get overexcited. And there are a number of elements to this. First of all, there's this headline figure of 369 billion US dollars. And of course, politicians see that and jump at it. They spend a lot. If you go a little bit below the surface, you see that could actually be more or less because it's an open-ended program. And you can also see that the way they distribute the subsidies is extremely inefficient. They are basically using measures which we used 10, 15 years ago and which we discarded then because they had such a high fiscal costs. And therefore, I would be very careful just to take this at face value. Just saying 369, a lot. Also, it's 369 over 7 years. You divide, right, and you get a bit more than 50 something. And we in the EU, if you count together all the national different subsidies, you get to much more than 50 billion per year. So we are already doing whatever, as much as the US will be doing, right, with the details just to. And then also if you look at the details of the Buy American parts, they're very mixed. And already here lots of trade lawyers and companies talking about how you can evade them, right? Just find the the small print. And we have now the German and the French economics minister in Washington trying to get a little bit more fine print in there, which will allow us or our firms to skate. And honestly, I cannot understand why people say, oh, there's the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and all European firms will go to the US to set up shop there. They still have a very strong demand here. So why should they close down production facilities in the EU to service the EU market?
Because costs will be lower there?
The costs in the US and some of the entrepreneurs, we were told, in the US you have full employment. And for these green industries, you need very highly specialized workers. If you can't find them, then the increased demand in the United States will hit a fixed supply, and perhaps most of these 369 whatever US dollars will just increase prices. So this is another aspect of why I think the measures they have adopted there are likely to have a very large fiscal cost and a relative modest or small impact on the environment.
And Daniel, your point is basically that the United States is subsidizing also mature technologies when it comes, for instance, to solar plant. So should we do the same thing? I mean, subsidizing something which is already in the field of mature technologies? Because maybe this could be the wrong answer.
That's what I wanted to add. If we want to have a reaction, right, saying they are spending so much on vaguely green, right, they are doing it in a very inefficient way. Inefficient in the details of the measures, inefficient in the part of the Buy American, which will increase prices. So first of all, if they shoot themselves in the foot, we should not do the same thing, right? That doesn't lead us anywhere. And as you just said, all these big subsidies they're giving are de facto subsidizing known technologies, right? Solar and wind, we by now know. That gets us to 30, 35, but if you want to reach zero, we need new technologies. And that's why if we want to spend more in Europe, then maybe if we have a European fund, we should say this should go towards R&D on new green technologies. New ones, right? Not something I give you 5 billion to build a plant here, but I have a big new research program.
For instance?
We can have a big new research project on next generation batteries. I'm not an expert on technology,
no.
right? We have European research programs which are quite successful. Let me add one thing. I'm pessimistic will come about for one simple reason. Because when you sit in the European Council and then you ask, okay, would you rather have some money allocated for your country or the same money allocated to a big pot where you're not guaranteed that your research institutes will get it? What is your reaction? All right, I will get mine. I think Marco assisted in that when the NGU project, funding was discussed. So that, I think, is the role of the European Commission also. They should push for that, not shooting ourselves in the own foot with excessive subsidies, but investing more in the future in research and development.
On this, if you agree, instead of having a strict round of questions, I would ask you also if you agree on this. I mean, basically what Daniel is saying that we don't really need so much subsidy, even because we already have a lot of subsidies, and probably that is not the best answer. So going this way, if it's fine with you, what is your view on the Inflation Reduction Act? And then we'll stop with you.
Sylvie, you come in? Or
no,
you give me...
Say, so I can start
okay,
with Sylvie with another question.
I agree on keeping cool. Okay, that is, I think, that's a general principle. So that is fine. Now, let me take a little bit... I think you're a bit too cool.
It's the role of the moderator.
Now, okay, the open-ended element is a potential danger. I mean, what we have had here in Europe is that large number ex ante, smaller numbers ex post. Also because, in a sense, it is not only because there is less tirage, on a less application, but also because by announcing large numbers ex ante, you stabilize the markets, and then you have the positive effects even before you actually spend any money. That's the experience of Next Generation EU, no? The stabilizing effect 1 year before we actually transfer a single euro. Nonetheless, I think here we may end up with something that is the opposite. With a measurable number ex ante, since it is open-ended, larger number ex post. I think it is true, Daniel, on subsidies, inefficiencies of that, but they have also tax credits, which is supposed to be, kick in very quickly. And that's why in revising now the state aid discipline, I hope in a very, very measured manner. I mean, tax credit is one of the things that the DG Comp and Madame Vestager will consider. On the skills, in the communication of the Commission of last week, actually, we had 4 strands: the regulatory, the financing, the trade, but we had also the skills. And here, it is true that in unemployment rates is higher, double than at the end of the day than the US. But in terms of skills shortage, we may be actually worse here than across the Atlantic, and there the fluidity of the labor market is actually higher than here. So I think we should definitely not overreact, and I think I would definitely try to avoid to replace a potential transatlantic divergence by measures which will create a divergence within Europe, which would be dramatic. But I think the right answer, which would improve, welfare, productivity, and I think is appropriate.
Maria, cool and quick.
I actually tend to agree with what Marco just said. I think the real fear here, because if you think about the act itself, there has a lot of good things in it. In terms of climate purpose, these are really very welcome. I know we're always complaining about the US, but this is actually, they're doing a lot of stuff that is good. What the fear here is that because of this, the tax incentives are such, and they're very quick, easy to implement, easy to understand, combined with the fact that energy prices in the US are very low, the temptation for European companies to leave is big. This is what we are afraid of. And so the question is, can we stop that from happening? But importantly, I think we need to identify those aspects of the act that are against WTO and fight those according to the rules. To try and countermeasures that actually also rise against WTO will never be a good story.
Sylvie, of course I want to know your point of view as well, but let me add something more. We started from, I said, first things first, with Next Generation EU. So the question, 1 million question here in Italy is, do we need another Next Generation EU? And I would add another piece to that. If we keep enlarging, if we keep attracting other countries, it would be possible also to imagine another Next Generation EU if we are even bigger. We were maybe lucky enough, so to say, not to have the United Kingdom when we took the decision on the Next Generation EU. So what happens if we keep enlarging the European Union, the Balkans? Of course, now there is the situation with Ukraine. So what's your point? What's your take on this?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I hope the microphone works. Okay, I have a very little voice, but I do it nevertheless. No, thank you so much for inviting me. What I've heard before, and I see many young faces in the room, which is nice, so I will try to be a little bit pedagogical. First of all, I like your title, because one of the most important questions is not only growth, is which growth. And sustainability and greening, it is at the heart of what the Americans are trying to do, but we must accelerate. So if I may, it's growth within the limits of the planet. And you may know the work of Rockström in Potsdam on the planetary boundaries on climate, water, etc. Even my voice is limited today. So this is the very important thing. I'm not sure, with all the efforts we welcome, Marco, that the transformation of the economy is really going far enough to face the challenge we have on sustainability. I say it with a certain gravity. I'm fed up with people saying that, oh, we were naive when we bought gas to Russia. We are naive if we don't listen to the scientists telling us that we are not on the right path from the economic point of view. Second thing, I wanted to ask several questions. This question of the IRA is like a mirror in front of us. First of all, when the treaties, the Treaty of Rome, the treaties are based on the belief that private initiative, openness, market, competition, of course, within a social framework, that all this is at the origin of creation of value. should we give up all this? So there is a philosophical question. Do we believe that states are, or the public authorities are the ones bringing wealth, or do we still believe in our own treaties? Maybe we should change. I'm saying this without any ideology, but this debate is, in my opinion, not taking place. Second point, and this is also very interesting because it's the US. When we talk about public authorities, what are we talking about in Europe? Is it the EU or are they the states? And here it was said before, you can always aggregate figures, but at the end the key questions, if the decision is taken in the council, is what about my country, my people? So there is a destruction of the single market which is going on, and this is very worrying. And once again, we cannot destroy what we have been doing for 60 years. On the other hand, we are always dreaming, and I see that Mario Monti is here, we wrote it in our book 10 years ago. The Europeans always compare themselves with the US. And they all consider, oh, super states, it would be horrible. So here there is a contradiction. Because in the US, no one is saying if the money is going to Texas or California. It is a federal decision, and the state, the level playing field is the United States. So now time maybe has come to be a little bit more self-critical. We cannot continue with a single market fragmented, a single currency which is not the single market, institutions conceived to be provisory, etc. There is a deep question of accountability behind all this. Third question, I remember when I was at the European Parliament and we were discussing on the semester and the idea to make a link between the money coming from Europe and some reforms was taboo. For me, the main added value of NGEU is to make the link between commitments in the general interest and money coming from Europe. But until now, we still have the cohesion funds. They are not at all built on this. So we are not making everything to be fit for global competition. We should tell the truth to the population. We don't prepare ourselves enough for climate, and we don't use all the tools we could have. Why? Because some people still pretend to fragment. And my very last point, and that's the reason why I appreciated Mrs. Marcegaglia when you said we should not talk about industrial policy. It is about competitiveness. It is about the society in which we want to live. Finance should be part of the reflection. Because right now we have very competitive startups, but when they need scaling up, they go to the US. They get financing in the US after the first phase. What does it mean? It means that the complete failure of the capital market union, we have been talking about blah, 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 as Mrs. Thunberg would say for something else, is not a reality. And this has an impact on our industry, on our future industry. And there is a trade-off between the old companies and the future ones. If you don't create the capital markets we need to finance the future, the innovation we need for the future, if you don't allow the private companies to do it, and furthermore, you allow state aid, I can tell you what is going to happen. The old CEOs, or less old, let's say the CEOs of the old companies, will find a way to their prime minister or to their president to defend yesterday's industry. The young people, they will not, or even the ones who are not born, are not going to be heard. So there is a trade-off between short-term and long-term, and by authorizing too much flexibility on state aid, we make the choice of the past. You were looking for a technology that could be the technology of the future. I was really struck by a small notice. I don't know if you noticed that private companies in the US seem to have found a way to do to create energy by fusion, by nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion could bring us a sustainable, very cheap, and infinite energy. Fusion is exactly what ITER is supposed to do, or do you say ITER? Or ITER, I don't know if other. When I was working with Romano Prodi 20 years ago, we were proud to bring ITER in Europe, in the south of France, with all the money coming from not only European states, but Japan, the US, Russia, China. We did not make the progresses made by one private company in California. Keep it in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, since we still have just 10 minutes, maybe I switch microphone. We still have a few minutes. Let's talk about something which is crucial in Europe. I will start again with Marco, but I want to know, of course, your opinion as well, which is the Stability and Growth Pact. Because we have to very careful recall that over the last 2 years, basically, we have been allowed to spend, even because, you know, the Stability and Growth Pact, there are many students, the famous 3% deficit to GDP, the 60% debt to GDP never respected by anyone starting from Italy. By the way, we are almost 3 times that level. No, not 3 times, but 150. Now this Stability and Growth Pact should be reintroduced by this year, Marco. And the European Commission made its own proposal, which is quite a divisive proposal, even because it is a compromise between Northern and Southern European countries. So what's your take, and what's all your take on this? I mean, should we really introduce it, reintroduce the former one with the 3% and so on, the new one, which is, keeps, by the way, the 3%, which is, you know, good to some extent, the European Commission proposal, but it can be also risky for some countries, especially the division in what we call, we are the country of the football, Serie A, B, and C, of countries in terms of public debt. If it is, you know, below 60%, 80 or 90, I don't remember, or we would be in Serie C, basically, Italy, so to say. Please, Mark.
Okay, first point, it was very tough to devise the response to the pandemic, politically very tough, economically was banal, because, I mean, at the time, the message was expand, do it on the fiscal, do it on the monetary, so that was, it took care of you know, supporting economic activity, propping up inflation, because now we are in but at the beginning of the pandemic we were still well below the 2%, and we took care of the financial fragmentation, so with the PEP BCB. Now, today there is a return of trade-offs, so that is, you see it, macro, micro, and in this, I think fiscal policy should, you know, start to play its role. Again, in particular, in this juncture here, the issue is, at the end of the day, we should not leave the ECB alone. So it implies that fiscal policy should be, you know, prudent. Now there is no need to support demand across the board. That would be a mistake. And the quality of public finance is actually more important than the quantity. So the two, what you do on the two sides of the budget is more important than the delta, which is the deficit. So I think this is. And going back to some form of rules, I think is important in this. However, we see that it would be self-defeating to try to jump back to the previous rules. I think these have lost credibility. There is no ownership neither in the fragile nor in the strong countries. So what we did, we put forward proposals back in November. So what is the process looking forward? There will be 2 ECOFIN councils before the European Council of March. In March, there will be, end of March, there will be a discussion at the European Council. The hope and we are working for that, is to come to some sort of a landing zone politically at that time. It is tough still, but I think not excluded that we will find an agreement. Actually, it comes to the European Council together with the package that we discussed just before. And the two issues actually is natural that they come to the same moment of truth, because one of the principles of the new rules is actually to take better into account and provide incentives for reforms and investments, which are precisely the reforms and investment we discussed about before. So there is, hopefully that would make the political capital more elastic and not be, under the syndrome of the lump sum of political capital. So they discuss one thing and there is no space for the rest. Now, if we manage to land with some sort of, at least the broad coordinates of an agreement at the end of March, then the Commission will come forward. It will come forward anyway, but that would be a better, would be in a better position with legislative proposals reforming the rules immediately afterwards, and we would then go for the, to have again broadly a political consensus on the new legislative package by the end of the year. This implies that when we come to January 2024, when, barring another Putin, we would repeal the general escape clause, then we would actually enter, at least in spirit, with the new, with the new rules and not, jumping back to the previous ones. And this implies that we would put more emphasis on credible, gradual reduction of public debt. Second, we would put more emphasis on the key indicator, the anchor, which is net expenditure, which is, I think, more controllable. I think we put emphasis and assess the investment and reforms, and also we will push beforehand member states to come forward with plans in April which cover both the fiscal and the structural, so that we would have a broad view of the of fiscal policy at the national and then also at the global level.
Okay, thank you, Marco. So let me ask now, starting from this side, what do you, especially Daniel, should we spend more? Do we need to spend more? And then, of course, to Sylvie.
Spend more on what?
Spend more if the stability growth path is not reintroduced.
As Marco said, there are two sides, right? As the,
because I know your answer. That's why I'm asking.
Let me answer with a tale of a southern European country which about 7 years ago got a new prime minister who said, I will not have austerity imposed on me by Brussels. And then actually he cut the deficit. First in the wrong way by cutting public infrastructure, expanding, and then keeping expenditure low. Right? 7 years on, this country, which had exactly the same debt to GDP ratio as Italy, is now 20 percentage points lower. Growth rate is much higher, and the risk premium has halved, more or less. Right? So that is possible, right? It's tough at the beginning, but the returns are very, very high in the medium to long run. I think that is one possible way how Italy could proceed. And at that point, I think the discussions about the Stability Pact will become moot.
Now, it's a long discussion we had with Marco years ago. What I want to say to the students listening is that if you look at the figures before the COVID crisis, the countries with the highest growth were not the countries with the highest deficits and debts. So the idea that there is a link between deficit and debt, and I say it being French, if it was the recipe France and Italy should be blooming. First remark. Second remark, something more fundamental. I'm really worried by something that is not said. The structure of our budget, of our national budget, will change because of the need to spend more for defense and security. And this is the biggest non-said truth of all our political debates. We are getting schizophrenic. You have people saying, well, we want strategic autonomy, we want sovereignty, but nobody says that we have not paid for our security in the last decade. So not only, to be honest, the question of the Stability and Growth Pact is an important one. I've always been in favor of respecting fiscal discipline. I don't know how to make people understand in our countries that to a certain extent what they are looking for, which is more social alliances, better skilling, better education, better hospitals, etc., may become at a certain point less a priority than simply defending ourselves.
Thank you. The last word from you, Maria, please.
Just maybe a thought on the new proposal that came out of the Commission. I think there is a lot of very good elements in the Commission on the rules. The expenditure rule is exactly what we should have had. I think the transparency of that is very good. I think the link to reforms. The link to reforms is excellent. I think that's the right incentive, and that's very much inspired, I think, by what we learned from the Next Generation EU. I think that's great that the Commission is transposing this on the rules. The fiscal rules. And then the last thing is the debt. I think the debt comes in very prominent in the rules, plays a very important role, and it brings us back to a very old debate when the rules were first designed, what is discretionary and what is a rule. I think the Commission has moved away from the rule part of the spectrum to discretion part of the spectrum, and I think that is good, but it politicizes also the process, and this is where all the discussions will be on. These are the discretionary part on how do you come down and for how long and at what speed and with what effort. This is the difficult part. Economists cannot answer that. I think it's a political process. But all the other things that came, including the fact that the Commission is saying that they will be very transparent in terms of how they will be evaluating the country's position, I think that is excellent news, and I think we should applaud the Commission for the effort that it made.
So thank you very much. I have many other questions. I apologize with the speakers, but unfortunately we have to make room, of course, for the new panel. So thank you very much. And now, please, thank you. Please remain seated as we simply step down the stage and we let the other speakers to get in. Thank you.
Connecting from Harvard. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I think we can start our second session after a wonderful first panel where we have discussed a bit about the more macro dimensions of the different drivers of growth in Europe. I also had many comments to the first panel, but for the sake of time, I will maybe add them throughout while we discuss with our distinguished speakers. I have on my right Anna-Katharina Hornidge, which is the director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. To my left, Cecilia Malmström, former MEP and Commissioner for Trade, and now visiting member of non-resident fellow of the Peterson Institute and visiting professors at Gothenburg University. And finally, very well known to all of you, Emma Marcegaglia, CEO and President of Marcegaglia Industries, the first female president of Confindustria and Business Europe. Welcome to all of you to this panel. And then Paul, my friend from Harvard. Ciao, Paul. Very nice having you here. Ciao. Professor of Economics at Harvard University, and probably, if not the one of the most prominent expert in the world on globalization. Can I say this? Yes. So I would start actually with Paul, and just to give a bit of an overview of how and to what extent the different dimensions of growth that we would like to explore in this session, trade, energy, investment, are going to have an impact on Europe. And Paul has been working a lot over the last year on this issue of whether and to what extent we are having peak trade and whether we are having globalization or deglobalization. And I would like to start from your take, Paul, on this. What do you think is happening at trade, and where do you see globalization going over the next year? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. I hope you all hear me okay.
Yes, perfectly.
I'm delighted to be here. I followed the first panel with lots of interest. It was a fascinating discussion. And I apologize for not being able to be there in person. This is my teaching period, so I couldn't squeeze in a trip to Italy at this point. So let me get to the question you asked about deglobalization. So as you were saying, I've spent some time looking into this. I first wrote about this in late 2020 when the pandemic was unwinding. And at that point, I basically didn't see much evidence, or at least much systematic evidence for deglobalization. And I look at it today and I still don't see anything systematic or any sort of hard evidence for the world economy having entered a deglobalization period. Now you might think, well, there's lots of talk about it. I've heard about a lot of companies that are moving things around. Absolutely, there's lots of anecdotal data, but for whatever reason, all this sort of anecdotes are not translating into changes in aggregate statistics. One way to think about it perhaps is, if you're trying to assess the labor market, we know that it's not a good idea to just focus on layoffs or focus on job destruction. There's also job creation. There's large gross flows behind the net flows that we might see in the data. And I think the same is true with trade and globalization. Similarly, obviously there's lots of interest in reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring, and I do think it's very important to kind of debate this new developments, but these are how that's translate into kind of firm level decisions that any evidence at this point is anecdotal. Now, obviously, the fact that it might not have happened does not mean that it not may end up happening. And that's something that already in late 2020, I emphasized. I made three broad points. First, that if there was to be deglobalization, which is certainly a plausible or possible scenario, I thought it wasn't going to be driven by technology. And I didn't think it was going to be driven by COVID. And this was written in November 2020, where there was still a lot of uncertainty. And there was lots of talks about it transforming the world economy. What I emphasize is that there was the potential for a big change and potential deglobalization, but it was going to be driven by large, but also persistent shocks. Only when you have this combination of something large, but also persistent, that's when firms are going to start reassessing what they want to do. And I also singled out two less technological or COVID-related factors but more institutional in nature, which is first the weakening of international organization, most notably the WTO, but also the increasing geopolitical tensions that preceded COVID, but were intensified during COVID. So where do I stand today? I do still think the main challenge is mostly geopolitical in nature, both in what I had emphasized in the past in terms of a weakening of international institutions, but also in terms of trade wars not having gone away. But also, I guess I'm a little bit more and more concerned about less tangible forms of geopolitical tensions, which is simply uncertainty. The fact that we've been for a while not knowing exactly where all this geopolitical situation is going to go, and that naturally constrains investment. What's happened, since I first wrote about this more than 2 years ago, first COVID, I say this hesitantly, but I think it's largely in the back mirror. And I do believe that there's wide consensus now that per se, COVID is actually not going to change world trade. Second, Russia invaded Ukraine. That's a big development in February of last year. And third, the US-China trade, or just broadly political relationship, has not improved. And if anything, it seems to have deteriorated. For instance, this is exemplified by this Chinese balloon incident, this balloon that was shut down on Saturday, and Blinken's decision to postpone his trip to Beijing. So certainly, that's still very much in the agenda. So I am worried about the geopolitical situation, and I do put a non-trivial probability to a deglobalization episode happening sometime soon. I'm perhaps less pessimistic than others for 3 reasons, and I'll conclude with that. First, as I've argued in the past, it's really not easy to re-optimize global production. When firms lay out their global strategies, they incur very large, significant costs. Many of those costs are sunk in nature. Again, it's going to have to take very large and persistent shocks to lead to, reorganizations of production towards more countries that are more friendly to us and things like that. Second, on Russia, frankly, it's a dramatic situation. I don't want to diminish it, and I know it's affecting some folks in Europe. But to a first order, Russia's economy is a gas station, and it's a fairly irrelevant economy. I don't think that per se the Russia situation is going to affect the world economy an awful lot moving forward. I'm much more worried about China, obviously, U.S.-China relationships and China relationship with many other countries. If China was to go their own way, that would be very problematic. We can talk more about the implications of that. I'm perhaps a bit less worried than others about China. First, because China is a very pragmatic country. I think that even in the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've taken a much more pragmatic view than other countries, and they seem to committed to making globalization work. I don't think that they can go their own way yet. They're not technological self-sufficient. The case of semiconductors is obvious. They still need Western technology. And finally, they're facing their own domestic constraints. I think China understands that if they went on their own and really led to a geopolitical divide, they would suffer important economic consequences. And recent street protests in China indicate that they face their own political constraints. So I'm gonna pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot for this initial overview on the role of trade and the persistence of globalization for the time being. I think, Cecilia, you would agree with that view probably, as far as I know. But do you think Europe could be playing within this context a more proactive role, trying to defend in any case, this global model, or should we try to, in a way, adapt our own traditional, very open stance to the rest of the world, to the changing conditions and the need, in any case, to refocus our growth model also to internal investment, sustainability, and all the transition that we are having?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Well, first of all, of course, you must always adapt to reality. I mean, things are changing, and you must keep up with that. That's what European citizens and global citizens are expecting from us. But the growth model of Europe has been to be open, to align with friends and allies in a broad sense, very broad friendshoring, and to always support, to develop and strengthen and to comply with international rules. Now, this is weakened right now, but I don't see that's a reason for not trying to keep up with them. And Europe has depended very much on trade. And that has been good for Europe. It has created lots of jobs, high quality, well-paid jobs. It has led to growth and investment, and it has created sort of boundaries that go beyond just trade. And that has been successful. Of course, trade has changed during the decades now. They're much more oriented towards sustainable trade, fair trade, trade that takes into consideration international conventions on human rights and labor. But that is something that should continue. We have successful trade agreements with many parts of the world. We have others just laying around there waiting to be ratified. Mexico, Mercosur, New Zealand, Chile, important partners and allies, which should continue. We should also reach out to others, continue negotiating with Australia, with Indonesia. India is a difficult partner, but nevertheless very important. And also engage with the Asia Pacific, where there's a lot of dynamism in this, at this moment. They have made lots of regional and international agreements, and we should look into that. So that model has been successful and should continue, because it is a way to build alliances as well, where you could cooperate on a much wider field than just pure tariffs and labor, of course, and tariffs and other standards. But of course, we also need to reform ourselves. The internal market, we talked about that earlier today. The internal market is a jewel in the European Union, but there's a lot to be done before it is really a completed internal market. We can gain a lot, both when it comes to jobs and growth. If we look at the long list that the Commission has made many times of what should be done to eliminate technical obstacles and facilitate public procurement and other issues. So there are lots of things to be done, and keep on, even if it's hard right now, working with partners and allies to restore, reform and strengthen the global system, because the EU cannot function in a system where there are no global rules. Well, it can, but it will be much more difficult, because it is not a geopolitical player in the way that China or US is. So that's why we shouldn't give up on them. And it's more important than ever. We saw that under COVID, and we see it under the climate crisis, that we do need international cooperation.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? You mentioned a series of countries with which we should start or finalizing trade agreements, but and clearly with the US, we have an open dialogue on so many different fields that probably limiting itself to trade or investment would be useless, because we have defense, we have energy, we have the Green Deal, etc. But what about the relation between Europe and China? You didn't mention China in this list of agreements, although with China we are negotiating an investment agreement. Where do you see the relation between EU and China over the next years?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't be meaningless to have a trade agreement between the EU and the US. True. I tried that once. It's in the freezer, deep down behind the ice cream. And it's not time to take it out right now. But of course, it would have facilitated a lot if we had a trade agreement right now on IRA. But coming to China, yes, we have this CAI, as the acronym says, which is an investment agreement. It is also in the freezer because of sanctions. When the EU and several other countries sanctioned 4 individuals because of the Xinjiang violation of human rights there, and then China responded by sanctioning around 30, 40 teachers, members of parliament, researchers, etc. in Europe. So that is also in the freezer, and I don't see any prospects of taking it out right now unless China lifts the sanctions, and it will not happen in the short-term basis at least. Well, China is a complicated partner. The Commission is working on updating the Chinese strategy. It is difficult because you have to have agreement as well. The answer cannot be to isolate China or to decouple from China. For economic reasons, it is not possible to do it, and it doesn't make sense either. But of course, there are sensitivities. We have been very dependent on Russian gas, and we saw what that led to us. Now we are very dependent on rare earth metals from China. China own and process and mine 85-90% of all the consumption in Europe. Not that they do it in China, but they own a lot of mines all over the world. And that is the new currency. I mean, it will not be gold or crypto or dollars. It will be rare earth metals, and they are totally needed in the green transition. So our dependence on them will increase with 100% just the coming decades. So this we need to address, and there we cannot be totally dependent on China. So we need to work, and we can come back to that maybe, to a more global alliance on raw materials. But on all the non-sensitive items, I think we should continue trading with China. We should continue to push for a greener trade with them where it's possible. We need China in the green transition. We need China if we ever want to reform or strengthen WTO. But of course, there is also the issue of more responsible trade. There are the human rights issues, the violation of labor standards, etc., which complicates matters. But to decouple from China is not the solution for Europe, I think.
Thank you. Moving to Emma Marcegaglia, I think as an entrepreneur, you would agree with Paul that it's not easy to re-optimize the global production system. There's a lot of hysteresis, there's a lot of resistance, since there are money that has been sunk into investment and into the build-up of value chain. Yet, competitive conditions are changing. The US has now an energy cost, which is a fraction of what Europe used to have. Because of the energy crisis, and then there is all this issue of subsidies that might also affect the business decision of firms, although we will be back on that later on. So do you think there is a trend in companies? I mean, Paul was quoting anecdotal evidence of companies now reshoring part of their production, moving production probably closer to home, and not necessarily home, but closer to home, working on some strategic nodes of their production chain, which have been revealed to be particularly delicate and need to be probably, let's say, backed up by, let's say, contingency plans, stuff like that. Do you see a trend into this, and where do you think it's going to stop in a way compared to coming back home altogether?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the invitation. We have this conversation at lunch also with Cecilia. So my point is that, yes, there is a kind of a part of reshoring, but in my opinion, this is not only for subsidies. It's more because it's a kind of risk management, you know. If, you know, for example, I used to buy a lot of some of my raw materials from China. Now we are not doing that so big, even very, very close to zero. Why? Because, you know, during COVID there was this supply chain disruption. So maybe you order some hot rolled coils, which is my raw material, and you could reach it, you could have it 4 months later. Or, you know, there was the port were shut down. Or, you know, there is, you know, the time was... So my opinion is that a part of reshoring is happening, is more because of risk management. Companies now understand much better that it's not only important to have the lowest cost supplier or the just-in-time, let's say, level of stock, but also here, you know, being safe in a certain sense, not only be safe as a country, which is very important, but also being safe in your supplier, in your supply chain is very important. Sometimes it's even more important than having the lowest cost ever. So some reshoring is going on. I don't think that we will reshore everything that we have outsourcing because I continue to think that a part of our production doesn't make sense to reshore it in Europe. It will not be economically, viable because some of this has to stay in some countries where maybe the costs are low. While, you know, the most high-level quality and where you need more research and investment, where you need very skilled people, it makes sense to be reshored. So overall, I think this is happening. I don't like also the idea of friendshoring, because first of all, I would like to understand who are friends, who are not friends, but this is not, but it's not, you don't, you know, as an entrepreneur, you don't move your production, your investment, that is a very costly and long-term view process, because you want to be with friends or with no friends. So I think part of the reshoring is going on, but because of risk management mainly. Of course, but then I think we will maybe say something also on IRA, but I think mainly this is the fact. And let me finish saying that I totally agree with Paul. I don't think we are in a deglobalization process structurally. But we are in a situation where, you know, politicians prefer to say, I protect my people. It's not so sexy to say, you know, it's better to have open trade, because open trade will create much more, you know, fight of poverty, which what happened in the past. So there is a problem of politicians being more, you know, now interested to, you know, really demonstrate to their people, to their voters, that they care about that, but that it's not clear what is the best thing to do it. And also there is, as we said before, there is a problem of security, there is a problem of defense, there is a problem of transfer of technology. So these are changes, but I don't think we are in a deglobalization process. And believe me, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I don't think this is in the interest of Europe, because we don't have raw material, we are strongly in export, demography is against us, you know, demography in the long term, I think, means also growth. So I think, and I agree with Cecilia, that we have anyway to keep the trade and the investment open, and this is also important, because in my opinion, the more you close market, the more you create conflicts, the more you really can create also a very strong geopolitical problem. So let's work and let's think that, of course, we don't have to be naive in saying everything is like it was in the past. It's not true. There are big challenges, but I don't think we should reinshore everything, close the market, saying that we are in a deglobalization. This is not true, first of all, and this is not what I think is in the interest of European people and European companies.
No, thank you. I fully agree with everything you said, but it is also true that, and here I ask to Anna-Katharina the same question I asked you over lunch, actually, because I want to hear what you think. Now, the fact that Europe, we are defending trade, we are, let's say, trying to protect the rule-based system, because here clearly we can defend ourselves versus a power-based system where US and China would clearly outcompete us on so many different directions. We are trying to defend the WTO and the multilateral system, although it is also true that Europe last month has approved this provisional agreement to force EU imports to pay the carbon adjustment, the carbon tax, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism, we discussed this over lunch, could be seen as a, let's say, equalizer of the tax, the need to tax carbon all over the world, but can also be seen clearly as a protectionist measure. So what is your take, and how is this initiative perceived by another key player in the manufacturing of Europe, which is Germany?
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, and thank you for inviting. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will speak out of the perspective of the institute I'm heading, which is an institute that mainly works on Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and on the different policy fields that basically facilitate cooperation on the national level, on the European Union level, as well as internationally on the multilateral level. So I'll try to bring in a few perspectives that maybe haven't been as strong in the discussion quite yet. And of course, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is an interesting example when we think about international cooperation and when we think about the European Union's strategy to foster global cooperation or not, basically. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is an interesting example because it's It's a mechanism that was developed with very little interaction with developing countries, basically low and middle income economies and also least developed countries. Their interests are very little playing a role in the CBAM and its design. And due to this, of course, it's also not that surprising that India and China at the moment, also in the discussions on the level of the WTO, have their problems with CBAM. Why? Because their interests were not basically taken into account to the degree that these countries would envision them. But one could say India and China have quite strong voices. What about least developed economies? For instance, Mozambique. Mozambique exports aluminium to the European Union, to Europe. For the European Union, it's a very small percentage of our import, but for Mozambique, it's making up 25% of their earnings through export. So it's quite important, and it makes quite a difference to the economy. Now, as part of these CBAM discussions, there were voices also coming out of the institute that I'm heading, IDOS, saying, well, least developed economies should be spared from CBAM straight away. That's not the case. So the do no harm principle that we apply in, for instance, international cooperation in conflict situations or in fragile state situations, the do no harm principle that basically says, well, if you interact, we need to make sure, or if you cooperate, we need to make sure that through this form of cooperation, we don't increase the problems at hand in the locality, but rather actually, of course, address them in a positive manner, does not apply here. Well, if you then look sort of further, it's quite interesting to see which countries are actually heavily affected by CBAM. And these are, quite a few of these countries lie in strategically extremely relevant areas of the world for Europe, of geostrategic importance. So the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So these are regions that, of course, also in the past year have gained even more geostrategic importance for the European Union and for Europe as a whole. And if we then sort of look at the policy making on the level of the European Union with regard to what one could call a global cooperation strategy, we see that the strategy for foreign policy of the European Union from 2016 actually painted a very ambitious vision. It actually worked with a partnership approach based on reciprocal partnerships, but with a clear focus on European autonomy. And it also referred to, for instance, the Agenda 2030, so basically the overall idea of fostering the global common good through fostering sustainable development. Now, if we look at the current one, which was actually published on the 24th of March last year, so basically a month after Russia's war in Ukraine started, it does not refer to an explicit, strategically reflected partnership approach by the European Union, and it also doesn't refer to the Agenda 2030 as overarching framework. So that's quite interesting because, of course, after the war of Russia in Ukraine, you would sort of consider this as an important part of the discussions, but of course it was prepared already before, so basically these reflections of fostering trusted strategic alliances, what was mentioned now several times, across all continents, across all income groups of countries. That's relevant, that's important. And not just across different political regime types, which of course we also do. We do cooperate, of course, with all different facets of autocracies and democracies, is not reflected in the current strategy. And at the same time, we see there's, I mean, that offers sort of quite a room, yeah, for activities, and then what are the next steps? Well, we have the Summit of the Future coming up, as announced by Guterres in 2024. It was pushed to next year. But one of the propositions of Guterres was to think about an SDG fund. Now, thinking about CBAM, one of the discussions of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms was again and again to use these funds to basically reinvest into the decarbonization of our own economies, but of course also into those economies that are especially affected by CBAM. One could, of course, now think, so far that doesn't take place. The connection between CBAM and also the Just Energy Transition Partnership Agreement, for instance, that is a part of the climate regime, does not exist yet. It's not an explicitly built-in tool yet. But of course that could be for the future. That would be sort of a next step to think about, well, does the European Union sort of come together and say, let's gear up towards and take up Guterres' suggestion for an SDG fund, and maybe here combine and build on the CBAM approach, develop it further, because of course the underlying idea, the core idea of finding ways of decarbonizing not just our own economies, but also push for just transitional processes in the countries we trade with is important, but has to take differences in the different economic development positions, of course, into account. And here that would be one step to think about.
No, it's a fascinating idea. I mean, to the ability to design this trade-based rule to promote SDG goals more explicitly would clearly be a very interesting policy experiment. Ideally, the forum for this discussion will be the WTO. Would it be working? But probably this is no way to go for the time being. So probably also given what you said, that some countries are going to be heavily affected, some developing countries, by a straight implementation of the CBAM, and even some EU interests could be, let's say, damaged by imposing a CBAM altogether in key areas. We're quoting Central Asia, North Africa. So probably will be up to the European Union now to design a mechanism that would try to, first of all, protect our own interests, because clearly as an entrepreneurs, you would have a strong disadvantage if the CBAM is not implemented, but at the same time, turn it into something that can be used through a number of, let's say, exceptions, adaptations, sort of like we did for carbon leakage system, where if you match certain circumstances, then you can be exempted, etc. So this is something that probably Europe has to really, as a world-class producer of standards.
Can I say, Carlo, just one thing, because as you know, I'm in the steel business, and so I know CBAM very well. So as I said, also during the lunch, if we take very seriously the energy transition, which we are, as also steel producer, we need to invest, and we are investing billions of euros on that. And the price of green steel, I want to say this very clearly, will cost more. The price will be higher. This has to be very clear. So if then from any other part of the world, some steel will arrive without the green CO2 emission at the same level with a lower price, this will destroy the industry. But as I said before, this has to have, the CBAM, in my opinion, has to have two important things. One, the level playing field in terms of CO2 emission, not be a protectionist measure, because as I said, some of my colleagues think this as a protection. And second, and this is happening, as also to push the other countries to invest. Maybe we need to help them as well, but to invest in green steel. I heard some of my supplier in India or in other places say, well, Now that the CBAM will be there, I will start, a part, they said, not all, a part of my production with, electrical furnace with lower CO2 emissions. So I think a good CBAM could also, push the other countries outside Europe to invest in green, in this case, in green steel. But so it's also a way to, to have other countries to understand that the green transition is something which we all have to invest.
Definitely, but it would require this reusing of the funds. It would require that it's actually built in, that the funds are then used for the fostering of decarbonizing processes.
The funds has to also to be used for the European industries to invest in that.
No,
so
it's a delicate discussion.
I understand, it's a part of it, yes.
But it's a fascinating thing. And probably I think within Europe we could find an agreement that would stand up to, also the needs, because on this we are. But okay, let's just move one step forward. I want to take advantage, I'm connected to that because it's also connected to green subsidies, etc. I want to come back to Paul, because we had, Paul, probably you were here with our first panel, a lot of discussion on the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Since you are now in the US and you're participating in that debate, I would like to know, how do you judge the IRA, the local content rules? And there was also a discussion that we had here on whether the IRA could actually be somehow made less efficient by the fact that it requires a lot of skilled jobs to be implemented, and these skilled jobs in the US seems to be very hard to find, or if anything, they cost a lot. So I just want to know what is your judgment on the entire policy, not only from the local content point of view, but also from a more macro perspective.
Great. So, I think we're all agreeing a lot on many things, maybe too much. So if you allow me, I'm going to try to be a bit provocative. I mean, I agree with everything you've just said. I agree with what Daniel was saying in the earlier session. But let me say a couple of things about the IRA that are perhaps a bit more contrarian, although they resonate with things that were just brought up. And then I'll try to make a bigger point. So the IRA, I mean, from a legal perspective, I mean, it seems to me it's an obvious violation of WTO rules. So to the extent that we are trying to foster the enforcing power of these institutions, obviously, that's a first-order reason to condemn it. From an economic point of view, as an economist, I think any economist's knee-jerk reaction would also be to condemn it. And why would an economist condemn it? Well, because, at least for two reasons. We know, first, subsidies are a form of protection, and they are typically what we call beggar thy neighbor policies. So they are benefiting one country. We could debate the extent of it, in this case, the US, but it's harming other countries. And similarly or relatedly, these subsidies often lead to what's called a race to the bottom, or a race to the top in subsidies, which would be that now the US did that and the European Union might retaliate and do its own set of policies. And we tend to think that, and our models often say that this is inefficient, okay? Because we may end up, governments may end up over subsidizing something. So my favorite example is this tax competition models that tell us that we may be over subsidizing or under taxing firms that might operate in different countries, multinationals, because we are tempted to lower our taxes to kind of try to attract them. Now that's all very standard. So to be a bit contrarian, I'm less sure that I want to think about this particular case that way. And the reason for that is because these subsidies, and that was brought up earlier too, they're actually trying to go after an important market failure, an important externality. And an externality that some scientists believe requires immediate action. So if we're currently in a situation where unilateral climate-friendly or climate change reducing policies are vastly suboptimal, maybe some competition is good. Maybe the US is going to go this way, maybe there's going to be some retaliation, but we're actually maybe moving in the right direction in terms of this. And that's something that I realized Sylvie actually brought up at some level earlier. So let me just say one more thing, and then I'll shut up, which is, it's less related to IRA, but it's related to the topic of this session, which is on the future of growth, which future of growth. And there's lots of super interesting stuff that's been brought up. There's only one thing that wasn't brought up, at least until Emma spoke about a few minutes ago, which is the issue of demographics, which I think is absolutely first order. So you look at European population in 1900, it was 25%, 1/4 of world population. We're down to 10, 11%. It's estimated to be 7% in 2050. Europe is shrinking in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. I mean, I maybe diminished the Russian invasion a few minutes ago, but you know, it looks like there's about 150 million Europeans, Russians, that are largely going to be largely outside the scope of the European economy for the foreseeable future. Okay, so that's a big shock to the size of Europe. In addition, population is aging. Okay, so this I think is very important. It has at least 3 leading consequences: loss of economic power and influence, innovation. People are, ideas come from people. Okay, and that's well established in the field of innovation. This can come at the cost of making it harder for Europe to be an engine of innovation. And third, there's potential troublesome scenarios for the sustainability of social security, and that's sort of more related to the aging. So I do think that, putting this discussion at the forefront is very important. What to do with it? One obvious solution is to have more kids. But if I talk to young people in Spain, I talk to my nephews and nieces, they don't seem very committed to this idea of having more kids. An alternative is immigration, which is obviously a politically and culturally very, very sensitive topic. But I do believe immigration policies need to be relaxed. Certainly in the country where I live, the U.S., but I think certainly in some parts of Europe as well.
Yeah, thank you that you brought up this issue of immigration policy. This is another element that we need to carefully control for in our, let's say, recipe for, in our quest for a future growth model, both in the US, for the reasons that we just mentioned about tight labor market, and in Europe, at least in Italy. I think, Emma, some firms in Italy are already, you were mentioning that they are below capacity, that in the US. But even in Italy, probably the capacity is constrained by the lack of starting to be constrained by the lack of skilled worker. By the way, personally, I think that immigration, there will be an important push for immigration, which will be unfortunately driven by the need to adapt to climate changes, because climate changes will have to, and say, unfortunately, they will probably force people to migrate vastly. And this is something that we probably need in the long run to address. Okay, now, so coming back on this local content rules and the potential distortion that it might activate. Coming back to Cecilia, you seem to be, of course, contrarian to the idea that Europe should retaliate on this, right? We should probably... however, there is the potential risk of EU companies moving to the US to that extent. And if that would happen, how would you think EU capitals would start reacting when they have one Irish company announcing that they will open up in the US, one Italian company announcing that they will open? These things appears on newspaper because of local content. How do you think we should face this type of political pressures in the end? Should we, what type of messages we should, try to convey to sort of prevent this risk from happening?
Well, that is obviously a very difficult question, and I don't have the answer to that. First of all, I think Daniel said we should be a bit cool, and I think we should. We are not in a trade war with the US. Now we have a war in Europe, and that is a very real war. And we need also to remain civilized and do better between the EU and US, because we are so aligned in our defense for Ukraine and our sanctions against Russia. And if we become too divided, the only guy smiling sits in Kremlin and his name is Putin. So we have to be very careful about that. So we are not in a trade war, and we should not claim that we are. Also, we have to see, I mean, some of these companies, yes, they are threatening. We haven't seen that happening yet. Some of them will probably move to the US. But what shall we do? I mean, what's the alternative to create a huge fund in Europe to make them stay? That was not going to happen. Nope. Who's going to finance that? Even if we had the money, it's not the right thing to do. So some of them will move, yes, but many will stay as well. And that's why we have to look at this in a broader context. How do we make Europe more competitive, more attractive? I referred to a few things. Other has been mentioned. Skills, as Paul brought up, is very important. This obsession of closing borders in Europe is harming us, not only for those who really need protection and asylum seekers, but also because we do need lots of migrant workers as well in the future. In the northern parts of the country, I come from Sweden, we need 200,000 people tomorrow. Engineers, miners, everything down to people serving in the cafeterias. And we don't know where to find them. And Germany needs, I don't know how many you need, 500,000, 1 million tomorrow?
300,000 in Italy.
300,000?
In Italy.
In Italy, yes. And this is also something about competitiveness, because the US will need skills, but US has a sort of historical attraction for good skills. So they will probably find a way, even if they will struggle. So all this has to be seen in a broader context, and not only about subsidizing this or that company to force it to stay. Also, being within the internal market gives a lot of advantages, and if you sort of lock yourself out from that, it also gives you disadvantages. So you have to be a little bit cool on this. But I don't think the solution is to create a huge fund to pay them to stay if they don't want to stay. But we should do a lot of other things.
Thank you. And Emma, do you think insofar, we are clearly lacking behind immigration and skills, but you countries have been doing a lot to curb the increase in energy prices, or at least try to avoid the worst consequence of it. Although with some consequences on budget, and we are discussing now whether this and how to harmonize at the European level the type of support that was given to energy crisis and to price support schemes, because this clearly is an important element of fiscal policy going in the right direction versus monetary policy, as Marco was mentioning before. Are you happy enough about what has been done, and do you think for a while we can cope with it if things normalize down the road, or do you think that the situation is really very bad and more needs to be done at the national level?
Well, so first of all, let me say that. Could you hear me? Yes. Yeah. That while the pandemic has been, first of all, a humanitarian disaster and has hit the whole world, let's say the energy crisis was an asymmetric shock for, of course, European company, because even now that the price of gas is much lower than before, we are still 4/5 times the price that the American companies are paying. So that's a big disadvantage from a competitive point of view. I think that what at the European level and also at the national level, I bring the Italian case because it's the one I know best, has been fine because, first of all the countries and our also strongly, start immediately to diversify the gas sources. We were all in this crazy situation that even after the invasion of Crimea, because this happened in 2014, there was already a war there. Our dependence on the Russian gas became even stronger than before. So we were all in this situation, say, okay, the gas in Russia is the best thing we can have, is the lower, it's very cheap, let's go on with that. So everyone after the war, understood that this was a total unsustainable thing. So I think a good diversification has started. well, Italy, of course, with Algeria, we have the TAP with Azerbaijan, and other kinds. We have also, ENI working a lot in Africa. So the diversification started very strongly. I think everywhere in Europe we started to invest in GNL, which before, also in Germany, but also in Italy, before talking about GNL was like building, a monster. Now everybody is working and having GNL, so that's good. There is also some talk on internal, let's say, gas production, which is going on. So I think this has been good. The second point is that everybody is now working more on, let's say, renewables. Still a lot to do, because even in Italy, but I understand also in Germany and other countries, even to start an investment in photovoltaic or that to take too much time. So, but now at least all the national countries are going towards a simplification on that, and also European Commission is push that, and this is very important. I think there has been also a strong energy efficiency, because everybody in Italy minus 10% of consumption, also thanks to, not today, that is very cold, but before it was a very good, let's say, winter. And coming to what has been done also at a European level, I think that the price cap on gas, which come very late, but has been a good signal. It's not that we solve the problems with the price cap. Of course not. It's together with what I've said: energy efficiency, the storage, the photovoltaic, the diversification. But anyway, this was a signal, a good signal. Also, the idea to common purchasing of gas has been a good signal. So, in the short term, I think what at the European level and national level has been done is okay. But still, on the long term, I think we have, and we said we have to do a good energy transition, a good, reduction of energy transition. But let me say, I think it's very important to do it in a proper way. I believe strongly that we have to do it, and companies and business have a big responsibility on that, but we have to do it in a proper way. I think, for example, the technological neutrality is very important. You don't have to say we need to do only, electrical vehicle and nothing. We have to do electrical vehicle, we have to do synthetic fuel, we have to do all the different things. We have to do CCUS, we have to do everything. So this is very, very important. But I think what you've done in the short term is fine. In the long term, we have to work on that. And I finish on that, on Cecilia's point, which I always agree with everything of what Cecilia said, but on this, not to completely. I think, and what also in the previous round table has been, I think we need an innovation fund, first of all, not because we have to reply to the IRA, which in my opinion will not function for the US. This is my opinion, because I said before, this will not be an Inflation Reduction Act, this will be an Inflation Increase Act, because this will create more inflation in the US. But anyway, it's discriminatory, it's not fine, we have to talk to them. But we need an innovation fund to deploy the new technology, the magnetic fusion, the hydrogen, all this part. I think we need an innovation fund with put all together, brain and things to understand what are the next technology. I agree with Cecilia and the other that before doing that, probably we need to deploy what we already have in the best way. But I think that for this new technology and for defense, as Ms. Goulard said, I think we need a new innovation fund in the next year.
No, thank you. I think this brings back one of the issues that Daniel mentioned on the fact that probably Europe, if anything, needs to invest rather than on subsidies, which are already there and probably need to be simplified. On this, Marco, by the way, when I think about a new NGU, everyone thinks at money. I think at governance, because NGU is a beautiful and very efficient way of coordinating national member states. So an NGU of industrial policies across member states would probably do the same effects that the IRA has today, by synchronizing and harmonizing and homogenizing and consolidating the plethora of aids that we now have. So if we can just have an NGO without money, I don't know if it's possible, but the idea of the governance of a common industrial policy of aids across all the countries with, every national country talking to the Commission in streamlining their own industrial policy and aids in a way that is consistent throughout all the members, like we did for all our investment and reforms for NGO across the flagship initiative that the Commission has put forward. That would help. But again, any new money would probably need to, foster innovation and new technologies, because we need to keep leadership on this. One last word, Anna-Katharina, is about how to involve our neighbors into this, because to me, North Africa, Central Europe are key players, not only for, let's say, our economic and immigration and energy, but also for our security. Any thought on this?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I mean, we have, of course, the Global Gateway Initiative by the European Union, and it promised 300 billion euro investment. I think it's very, very important to make something happen with this. I say it purposefully like this. It's been discussed at the EU and AU summit, which was April last year, April or May, something like this. Last year, since then, we have seen very little, but the talk of it being a relabeling, a rebudgeting, and basically beautiful headlines coming also out of partner countries, especially on the African continent, becomes louder and louder, and it's understandable. So action needs to follow the headlines. This is one aspect. I think the Just Energy Transition Partnership instrument that has been signed with South Africa and with a number of other countries by now, Indonesia, India, Kenya in an altered version, I think Senegal as well. It's not a European Union only instrument, no, but it brings together through a plurilateral approach the strengths of quite a number of countries and organizations, and enables what has been discussed now here several times, no? How to find ways of modernize by decarbonizing, and this in a partnership approach and by paying attention to the joint responsibility to battle climate change, not it being the responsibility of one region only or the other region only. So I think these are good approaches. I just want to mention on the global level, the G20, of course, is keeping all of us busy at the moment. And I think it is important here to think about a Team Europe approach within the G20. We have, of course, quite often sort of the G7 forming a subgroup within the G20, which is sometimes very risky as well. But to think about a Team Europe approach within the G20 and here also, basically represent European Union's interests and Europe's interests is a way to think about in order to fill also the negotiations on the under the Indian presidency and assure that the Indian presidency, similarly as the Indonesian presidency, actually is turned into a success also in a time that is difficult. Indonesia was impressive in a way, seeing how difficult it was given the geopolitical tensions. Yes.
Okay, so I think time is up. I really want to thank all of you, first round of panelists and the second round of panelists, for the many invaluable inputs. I think, Antonio, we need to write a second policy brief right away because we are full of suggestions. And thanks to all of you for attending, and I hope to see you soon here at ISPI. Thank you to all of you. Thank you.